Have you ever felt too small to face a colossal challenge? Have you ever felt the butterflies in your stomach when you faced something that seemed impossible with minimal resources? Imagine the nation of Israel living in terror. For 7 long years, the Midianites and Amalekites, like a plague of locusts, invaded their lands, destroying crops and stealing livestock. The people were starving, living in caves and hiding places, completely afraid and without hope. It was a time of deep despair, where resilience was exhausted and faith was shaken. With each harvest, the same scene was repeated. The sweat of the harvest turned to ashes, hunger knocking at the door, and the constant shadow of the enemy. Families huddled deep beneath the rocks. Children learned to fear the invaders before they could even speak, and elders sighed, remembering times of peace that seemed like distant legend. The oppression was so severe that the very identity of the people, their ability to support themselves, was being eroded day by day. The memory of God seemed distant, or perhaps they felt that they had been forgotten by the Creator himself. The nation was on its knees, not in worship, but in humiliation. It is in this scenario of humiliation and helplessness that God decides to act, not through a great warrior or imposing leader, but through someone who considered himself the least of the least. Gideon, a young Israelite, was threshing wheat in the winepress, an unusual place for this task, which was usually done on open threshing floors. He did it in secret, sneaking around, trying to save what little was left for his family, feeling firsthand the impotence of his people. The image is vivid, the dust of the wheat mixing with the sweat of his effort and the weight of his frustration. With each stroke of the stick, he not only separated the grain from the chaff, but also felt the weight of his own insignificance. He saw himself as part of the problem, not the solution. His thoughts probably torn between resignation and a twinge of indignation. Where is the God who freed our fathers from Egypt? It was at this very moment of vulnerability and apparent insignificance that a divine voice reached him. The angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, sitting under an oak tree in Ephraim, and greeted him with a surprising, almost ironic statement, considering the situation. "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." Gideon, in disbelief, and with his heart heavy due to his trials, asked, "Ah, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about?" He could not reconcile the divine promise with the cruel reality he was experiencing. The angel's answer was even more impactful. "Go in your strength, and you will save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" The order was clear, but Gideon's doubt was enormous. He, who saw himself as the weakest of the weakest family of Manasseh, and the least in his father's house, was being called to the greatest mission of his life. A mission that seemed an unbearable burden on his shoulders, demanding a faith that he did not yet fully possess. The shadow of Midianite oppression was immense, and the divine calling seemed disproportionate to his capacity, despite God's promise. Gideon felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task and by his own insecurity. He knew the magnitude of the challenge. The Midianites were an overwhelming force, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, repeatedly invading Israel and wreaking havoc. To be certain that this voice was indeed the voice of God, and not an illusion or a wishful thinking of his own weary mind, Gideon asked for a sign. It was an act of humility and caution, not of total disbelief, but of seeking irrefutable certainty before leading a nation to war. He did not want to lift a finger, nor raise an army, unless he had absolute confirmation from heaven that he was on the right path, and that the promise of deliverance was not the fruit of his own desperate hope. He needed a sign that was undeniable, a divine intervention that would dispel any shadow of doubt in his heart. Gideon proposed an unusual but ingenious test that could only be manipulated by a supernatural force. If there be dew only on the fleece, and the whole ground be dry, then shall I know that with mine hand thou wilt save Israel." He placed a fleece of wool upon the threshing floor, a place that would normally absorb the night's moisture evenly. The next morning, the test was manifested exactly as he had requested. The fleece was soaked with dew, and he was able to squeeze out a bowl full of water, while the ground around it remained mysteriously dry. The sight, with each drop dripping from the fleece, was the visible confirmation of divine intervention. His heart must have been filled with a mixture of amazement and renewed hope. The clarity of the sign was unmistakable. The distinction between dry and wet was a living testimony to the power of God. However, the mission was so great, the weight of responsibility was so immense, that Gideon dared to ask for a second test, to solidify his conviction and eliminate any trace of uncertainty, with a boldness that revealed his persistence and his quest for complete assurance. He said, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just this once. I pray that the test of the fleece be reversed, that only the fleece be dry, and that there be dew on all the ground." Again, the next morning, God granted his request, showing his patience and understanding for human frailty. The fleece was completely dry, while the ground was wet with dew, glistening with the moisture of the night. There was no longer any doubt. The two tests of the fleece were the undeniable confirmation that the call came from God and that he was truly with Gideon. It was not his own initiative, nor a human suggestion, but a divine command for a greater purpose. Gideon, now strengthened by the certainty of God's direction, was ready to rally the army of Israel. Fear may still be present, but faith had stepped forward, driven by the clarity of God's will. He had received the seal of approval from on high, and the nation, though still under oppression, began to glimpse a chance for freedom. Through this unlikely leader, with the conviction now firmly established that God was with him, Gideon, the newly appointed mighty man of valor, began to blow the trumpet, echoing the call throughout the land of Israel. Men from the tribes of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali responded readily to his call. The response was impressive. 32,000 men assembled, forming a sizable army ready for battle against the fearsome Midianites. For a human military leader, having 32,000 soldiers seemed like a good start, a solid base from which to face his many enemies. Gideon could understandably feel a sense of relief and a sense of pride. Finally, we have a respectable number. Now we can fight as equals and deliver Israel by the strength of our weapons and our valor. The excitement must have been palpable in the camp, the anticipation of a great victory growing with each new group of warriors that arrived. But God's logic is radically different from human logic. As Gideon and his 32,000 men camped near the spring of Harod, ready for battle, the Lord spoke to Gideon with an instruction that defied any conventional military strategy, any calculation of strength, or any logic of warfare. The divine voice rang out with unmistakable clarity. "The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, so that Israel will not boast against me, saying, 'My own hand has saved me.'" This was a watershed statement. God did not want the victory to be attributed to Israel's strength or numbers. He was determined that the glory would be his alone. He was about to demonstrate that salvation comes not by multitude, nor by human power, nor by military prowess, but solely by his sovereign power and grace. He wanted Israel, and the nations around them, to know that it was the hand of the Most High that delivered them. The first order of reduction was drastic and psychologically challenging. "Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, 'Whoever is fearful and timid must return and depart from Mount Gilead.'" Imagine the scene. Gideon stood before his army, having to announce a dismissal based on fear. To the surprise of many, 22,000 men, a vast majority, turned and went home. An astonishing number. More than 2/3 of the army simply walked away, revealing that beneath the veneer of bravery many carried deep fear. only 10,000 men remained. This event alone was a test of faith for Gideon and those who remained. His army had shrunk dramatically, but the challenge against the Midianites remained the same, if not greater. This was not just a military selection, it was a spiritual purging, separating those who trusted in the flesh from those who were willing to depend totally on God and His plan, no matter how unusual it seemed. Gideon's faith was being forged in the fires of uncertainty, but he pressed on, driven by the certainty of God's voice. With only 10,000 men remaining, Gideon could have felt a mixture of relief at having a more select group and, at the same time, a twinge of anxiety at the massive reduction. The pressure was mounting. The responsibility of leading such a small army against an overwhelming force was immense. But God was not finished yet. Divine instruction came again, even more startling and specific, revealing that the initial reduction was not sufficient for God's purpose. The people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them there. It was a final test, an even finer filter that would reveal not only the courage but the alertness and readiness of each soldier. God was looking for men who, even in a moment of apparent rest and basic need, would maintain their alertness and vigilance, demonstrating a warrior's mindset that would not allow for complete relaxation. The lesson was clear. In a battle of faith, distraction and complacency have no place. Gideon led the 10,000 men to the river to drink water. This scene is crucial to understanding the depth of the test. Most of the men, exhausted from the march and thirsty, knelt down to drink water without a care in the world, immersing their faces in the water without taking their eyes off the horizon. They prostrated themselves completely, without any concern for what might happen around them, immersed in their immediate need. This posture, although natural for someone who is thirsty, revealed a lack of vigilance, a certain complacency in the face of imminent danger. However, a small group acted remarkably differently. Only 300 men did not prostrate themselves. They lapped the water with their hands to their mouths, like a dog, keeping their heads high and their eyes fixed on the surroundings, ready for any threat that might emerge from the enemy camp. Their posture indicated constant vigilance, a readiness for the coming battle, even as they quenched their thirst. They did not allow themselves to let their guard down completely. This distinction, seemingly so simple and based on such a trivial gesture, was profoundly significant to God. The 300 men demonstrated not only physical discipline, but also the alert warrior's mentality, which did not allow itself to relax completely even in a moment of basic need. It was then that the Lord declared to Gideon, sealing the fate of the battle and the way in which glory would be manifested. With these 300 men who lapped the water, I will save Israel, and I will deliver the Midianites into your hand. The rest of the army, the 9,700 men, were dismissed and sent back home. Gideon, the man who had considered himself the least in his father's house, now had under his command an army of only 300 men to face a Midianite force that was as numerous as locusts, literally hundreds of thousands of warriors. The proportion was absurd. Humanly speaking, the mission seemed like suicide. But therein lay the essence of the divine strategy. The glory of the victory would be entirely God's. Gideon's faith would be pushed to the extreme, but God's promise was the only guarantee, demonstrating that power does not reside in numbers, but in obedience and total trust in the one in control. With the 300 men selected, Gideon was given a divine strategy, a tactic that would have been considered ridiculous or suicidal by any human military general. Instead of swords and shields, the conventional weapons of war, the men were given trumpets, empty pitchers, and torches. Imagine the confusion in the hearts of those warriors. How could a tiny army defeat an enemy horde, equipped with lethal weapons and overwhelming numbers, using only musical instruments and clay pots? It was a strategy that required not just blind obedience, but a radical faith that power lay not in the effectiveness of equipment, but in divine order. Each man was to trust that God would do the impossible through his unusual methods, transforming the ordinary into a catalyst for the supernatural. The lack of conventional weapons was a constant reminder, with every step and every heartbeat, that victory would come not from military strength or combat skill, but from the supernatural intervention of the Lord of hosts. Yet, to strengthen Gideon's already strained faith before the impending battle, God offered him an additional incentive. He instructed him to go down to the Midianite camp with his servant Purah, to hear what the enemy was saying. This command was a call to courage and confirmation, and it was there, in the dead of night, amid the sounds and darkness of the vast enemy camp, that Gideon overheard a conversation that changed everything. A Midianite soldier was telling a companion about a disturbing dream he had had. A loaf of barley bread, a simple peasant food, a symbol of humility and poverty, rolled and struck a Midianite tent with force, completely collapsing it and turning it upside down. The other soldier interpreted the dream with evident terror in his voice. It is none other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given the Midianites and all the army into his hands. This conversation, heard in the shadows of the night, was the final and undeniable confirmation that Gideon needed. The enemy themselves, through a prophetic dream and their own terrified interpretation, were recognizing the hand of God in the coming battle and the fate that awaited them. The barley bread, a symbol of the simplicity and apparent weakness of Israel and Gideon, represented the instrument that God would use to crush the arrogance and brute force of the enemy. Upon hearing this, Gideon fell prostrate in worship, his heart overflowing with gratitude and renewed courage. Doubt was gone. The certainty of victory settled deep within his soul. He returned to his small army with the unshakable conviction that God had already delivered the enemy into their hands. It was no longer a question of if victory would come, but of how God would act through the obedience of his few and unlikely warriors. The bizarre strategy no longer seemed so bizarre, for faith had replaced all the fear and uncertainty that had previously gripped him. The stage was set for a spectacular miracle. Have you ever found yourself in a situation that left you completely lost, where human logic said it was impossible to win? Just as Gideon heard a promise that seemed to contradict reality, what is the promise of God that you need to hear and believe today, even when everything seems to be against you? Think about it. Block 6. The miraculous victory in chaos in the enemy camping, the middle of the night. Under the darkness that covered the valley, Gideon's 300 men divided into 3 groups and surrounded the vast, sleeping Midianite camp. Each man stood at his post, with the trumpet in one hand and the pitcher with the flaming torch inside in the other. The silence was tense, dense, broken only by the wind and perhaps by the rapid beating of hearts, which echoed like war drums. It was the decisive moment, the turning point for Israel's freedom, the climax of faith and obedience. Gideon, with the firm and authoritative voice that divine certainty had given him, gave the final order: "Look to me, and do as I do. When I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. And when I blow the trumpet, and all who are with me, then you shall blow the trumpets also all around the camp, and say, 'For the Lord, and for Gideon.'" This was not just a military instruction. It was a battle cry, a declaration of total dependence on the power of God. Suddenly, the signal was given by Gideon, in an act of perfect synchronicity and obedience. The 300 men simultaneously blew their trumpets, a loud, piercing blast that echoed through the valley, piercing the silence of the night with deafening intensity. Then, with a unanimous cry of "By the sword of the Lord and of Gideon," they broke the jars with controlled violence. The sound of the earthenware jars shattering reverberated like thunder, multiplying 300 times, and the flaming torches were suddenly revealed, shining brightly in the darkness, giving the impression of an army far, far larger than it actually was. Each light that emerged from the broken jar seemed like a new battalion appearing out of nowhere. The effect was devastating and instantaneous. Chaos broke out in the vast Midianite camp, awakened abruptly by the deafening sound of trumpets that seemed to come from every direction, the crash of pitchers, and the sudden appearance of hundreds of lights on every side. The Midianite soldiers were seized with utter panic. In their confusion and night terror, they thought they were being attacked by a gigantic, invincible army coming from all sides. In their desperation, unable to discern friend from foe in the darkness and tumult, they began to fight among themselves, attacking each other in the darkness, seeing enemies where there were only their own comrades. The sword of one was turned violently against another. The cry that reverberated by the sword of the Lord and of Gideon was not merely a battle cry, it was a curse, striking unearthly terror into their hearts. The flight was disorderly, a mass stampede of a vast army that was self-destruct, running blindly toward its own annihilation. Gideon and his 300 men did not even need to fight with their swords. The battle was entirely the Lord's. The deliverance of Israel was an undeniable miracle, a living and dramatic proof that God's strength is perfected in human weakness, and that his strategy surpasses any military logic. Gideon's story is not just an ancient tale of war. It is a timeless mirror for our own lives, an invitation to deeply reflect on how we face challenges and our own capabilities. How often do we feel small, inadequate, or completely incapable of facing the Midianites in our lives? Whether it's an overwhelming financial problem that seems to overwhelm us, a health challenge that weakens us, a family crisis that tears our heart apart, the search for a purpose that seems unattainable, or even a deep fear that paralyzes us, the feeling of helplessness can overwhelm us and make us give up before we even try. Gideon teaches us that the first fundamental lesson is to listen to God's voice, even when it calls us to something that seems crazy, to a path that defies all logic and human reason. He could have ignored the call out of sheer fear or self-deprecation, but his willingness to ask for confirmation and ultimately obey paved the way for a miracle that would change the destiny of his nation. His humility in recognizing his weakness was the starting point for the manifestation of divine power. The drastic reduction of the army from 32,000 to just 300 men is the most striking and counterintuitive part of the narrative, because it completely subverts military and human logic. This divine action serves to teach us a profound truth. God is not interested in our numerical strength, our superior intelligence, our abundant resources, or our social influence. He is fundamentally interested in our total dependence on Him. When we feel weak, when our resources are scarce, when the situation seems hopeless, that is precisely when God's power can be most gloriously and unquestionably manifested, because the victory will undeniably be His, not ours. It is in our insufficiency that God's sufficiency is revealed. Think about your own pitchers and torches, that which seems insignificant in your hands. That which you value least about yourself may be precisely the instrument that God will use to bring about great deliverance or radical change in your life or the lives of others. Perhaps it is a simple skill that you take for granted, a genuine word of encouragement that can change someone's day, an act of selfless service, or even your own vulnerability and imperfection placed in God's mighty hands. Do not underestimate what God can do with the little that you have. This story reminds us that faith is true power, the engine that drives the impossible. It is not the absence of fear, but rather the courage to act in spite of it, to take the first step, trusting fully that God is greater than any enemy, any obstacle, any unfavorable proportion that stands before us. If you feel too small for a giant challenge, if the mountain before you seems insurmountable, remember the story of Gideon and his 300 men. Remember that with God, the minority becomes the majority, human weakness becomes divine strength, and the improbable becomes a spectacular miracle. May the powerful story of Gideon inspire you to trust fully in the power and faithfulness of God in every area of your life. What is the giant you are facing today? What step of faith is God calling you to take, even if it seems small or illogical? Leave us a comment and share your story. If this video touched you, like and share it so that more people will be inspired to trust in God's power.